Death. Death gods and death energy, death entities were a cornerstone of many pagan societies. Unlike how modern people and modern mainstream religion considers death to just be associated with everything bad, the ancients saw death as a fundamental force of nature, as equal and legitimate as life itself. Today, let's learn how to effectively and safely work with the energies of death. Hello everyone, I am Solomon Pakal. I am a generational Brujo of Kachikal Maya descent. I am a historian, and I am an occult researcher. I've been going on the practice for over 2 decades now. Today I am repping Deathware. This is the Aztec god of death, and this whole shirt's pretty rad. So, death energy, by common religion standards, is like shunned. They don't want anything to do with it. They think everything to do with death is basically to do with the devil too, which is not exactly true. It's not even exactly true within their own paradigm of, I guess you could say, like the more conventional religions, right? The mainstream ones. But that is contrary to how pagan societies and more esoterically inclined societies viewed death. In fact, even modern-day witches and certain types of magicians, the way they view death is not in line either with a lot of pagan societies. So both sides typically got it wrong. Death is such a provocative force that you have certain practitioners basically subscribe to it as their label. Like, I guess necromancers were and are a thing, that is true. But new labels have kind of taken the forefront of what it means to work with death. Some of these labels are just like inaccurate. Words mean things. And if you are going to choose a label that basically subscribes you completely to death, that is still not historically supported. Nor do I think that these modern practitioners that subscribe to such death labels, I don't think they are doing anything more than going for walks in graveyards. To really engage with death energy, there's a certain severity that you come face to face with if you're really doing it right. There are some people that, especially in other countries, but this is also in the United States as well, where you find they are constantly conjuring death, and they look like it. So how do we work with death in a meaningful way that we can get knowledge and wisdom that is almost exclusive to the death current? And how can we do practical spell workings with death energy without it having any negative effects, but also with it having actual effects besides aesthetics and besides goth aesthetics? How can we make death magic actually work for us? First off, we have to recognize how apex classic pagan societies regarded death and see if we can work within a similar manner. If you look at classic Greek society and classic Maya society, I mention the Maya because that is my expertise in history. Most pagan societies, especially of the classic variety, we're talking apex civilizations, art, architecture, science, math, things like that. They regarded death as a seasonal force. Death was not an enemy of existence. Death was a part of existence. This is why you had deities of the underworld, such as Hades, regarded in very similar status to Zeus. This is why even in the ancient Maya world, the death god was worshipped in a protocol that also complemented the maize god. None of these death entities, none of these death gods were meant to be worshipped without any bounds or barriers. They were not just worshipped arbitrarily. They were part of a holistic cosmology that reflected in the seasons. Typically, winter was the time of the death gods where they would rule. They would defeat the gods of life. And then when the spring came, the gods of life would return the favor and defeat the death gods. This is repeated in the ancient iconography of many cultures. From specifically a Maya perspective, death entities and the gateways to the underworld were found where rituals would be held in caves as essentially a natural temple, a geologically constructed temple to the forces of Mitnal, or Xibalba, the underworld. Another form of gateways to the underworld for the Maya were cenotes, underground caverns that were waterways, too. This was a watery entrance into the underworld. And the gods would be appeased here. And not simply just the gods of like death proper, but also you would have like Chak, who would be present in the cenotes because he ruled water. But they did believe that the death gods needed to be appeased and honored in a specific way to honor that certain element of existence that death is. I'm also speaking for the Maya perspective here as well, whereas death is as a day sign, and then in other, I guess, conceptual regards, death is really not that bad. Death is actually very, very positive in Maya paradigm, and this is why. It's not to do with like bloodshed and stuff like that. Is that death is the beginning of the ancestral current. Because life doesn't end after death. It's a new type of life, essentially. A new type of existence that one has to take. And specifically hearkening back to like the classic period of Maya kings, these kings and queens would reach apotheosis, essentially the highest position that any entity could have outside of the gods. Everyone would have an afterlife journey. A lot of people would start in the underworld and have to work their way up through the levels of creation to get to the heaven, but there was still some kind of afterlife journey. And death as a day sign, death as a concept or an energy was the beginning of a said second life and would be the primary guiding force for people to ascend the levels of creation. And they could also come back and give wisdom to their descendants or anyone who called upon them. The ancestral current of magic, period, is a whole nother subject, but it's, I think, misunderstood in a lot of ways. It provides level of power that a lot of people don't get. People think ancestral magic is either calling grandma or like necromancy. And it's actually a lot more than that. The whole concept of apotheosis is housed within ancestral magic. Because one day we will become ancestors. And that's the whole, one of the main purposes of doing magic in real life is to have a better sense of determination or determinism after death. So that you have a say in what happens to your form, essentially, after death. And apotheosis means that there are higher levels to rise to. Ancestral magic and the apotheosis of, like, royal dead, for instance, is essentially the highest form that egoic creatures can rise to without assimilating back into the god spectrum, or without assimilating back into the pleroma, or like in Buddhism when they're going back into the source. In Gnosticism, there's the monad and returning to the monad, right? That oneness, which within the oneness, at least in the Maya perspective too, there's this the plurality of God. The duality is the highest. And that's another subject, really. There's duality and unity all kind of happening all at once. In a nutshell. I'll talk about that another time. If I may extend a tip on how to tap into death currents. A lot of people meditate in graveyards, and there are certainly paths for that, like legitimate agora in India, right? They do that. And while you don't have to be disrespectful in order to do that, it's very easy to become disrespectful, like treading on a graveyard and essentially just inviting yourself. And you might announce, you might say like, oh, may I come in and stuff, but it's still somebody else's resting place, and it's very easy to misinterpret the invitation if you think you got one. So I'm not saying not to do it. I would actually encourage experimenting with that, but I don't think it's as easy of a thumbs up as a lot of people are making it out to be. It's more often than not disrespectful, and this is coming from experience in folk magic traditions. I come from the Afro-Latino folk magic scene in Washington, D.C., where going into graveyards was, I don't want to say super commonplace, but it was a practice that had a frequency to it. And there was always a type of etiquette that you had, and that you would always have to cover your head, for instance. And from what I have seen from so-called death witches, death magicians that are on the internet, is that they are not being very respectful. That they are being very casual about it. They're being very self-entitled about it. And they are mostly aesthetic. I think graveyard work has its place, but I think it's actually for more advanced practitioners. I would also say that if you're going to work in graveyards, you definitely should be having a more well-rounded practice than just graveyards. I would extend to you what I believe would be a more powerful practice than graveyards, because you might be stepping on a lot of toes with graveyards, where you don't have to step on a lot of toes if you meditated in a cave. If you could get to a cave, do some magic in a cave, meditate in a cave, develop a relationship with the spirits of that cave, and then extend it out to the actual like gods of death and stuff like that, now you are talking about some real power that doesn't have to tread on a lot of established boundaries. Because even if there are spirits in the cave, there's like maybe one hard boundary, which is the entry of the cave. Going from grave to grave and the graveyard itself, like that's a lot of sovereignty that you may be treading on. So I don't encourage you do that. I would encourage you to go to a cave first and try developing a death practice around that. But the number one like mistake that contemporary sorcerers make is that they're not fitting in death and dark magic period in a holistic system. Yes, there are certain paths around the world that prioritize darkness. I mentioned the Agori. A lot of people like to just kind of cop out and just say the Agori without actually have ever talked to an Agori person or really study it much. They just kind of like hear about it, they think they get the gist of it, and then they say that. So I lived in India. And while I never met Agori people, I met various kinds of sadhu babas. And I'll tell you right now that sadhu babas might as well be Agoris, because they're very different from most like magicians in the world. And most magicians in the world would think sadhu babas are too extreme. And the sadhu babas are not as extreme as the Agori typically. The Agori, why and how they adopt dark energies is by literally becoming vagabonds to society in comparison to society. And I got a lot of respect for that, because like that's really going all out for spirituality, man. That's really being about that life. So I have actual respect. But you are doing things that are contrary, like many times very illegal and unhealthy. And they do it like that, and they are not. How many Agoris are you going to find on Instagram? How many Agoris are you going to find on TikTok? They don't live very comfortable lives, is what I'm saying. And a lot of dark sorcerers or people that are obsessed with dark things and death things, they are still trying to look pretty for the gram. They're still trying to go to coffee shops in Paris. They are still trying to make 6 figures. And these are things that are not really in line with that kind of path. What would behoove them more, if they want to do all that, is have a more holistic path where they are working with gods of death during appropriate times, and then they're working with gods of life at appropriate times. This is very well documented across many pagan societies, that they saw death, they saw life, they saw love, they saw war, all a part of a vastly holistic cosmology, and they lived in tune with all of these forces, and they honored them appropriately. They honored them accordingly. And many of the habits and trends that are going around the occult community these days, and the spiritual community period, including manifestation culture, is not holistic. It is asymmetrical to unhealthy degrees, and inauthentic degrees as well. It should be up to the sorcerer and the magician and the witch and the manifester to engage with all of these feelings and forces of nature in cyclical manners. That is what led to apex civilizations, by even today's standards, rising to levels of affluence that are still regarded as some of humanity's greatest achievements to this day. Therefore, to have an optimal practice with death energies and death deities is to actively engage with them. Gave you the cave example. Another tip on how to do it is to keep it seasonal. Work with them tail end of fall and into the winter. Cycle them with gods of life during the appropriate times of year. You can do it that seasonally as well, or you can figure out kind of a balanced practice. Use planetary magic too. Saturdays for your days of death. There you go. Then follow them accordingly to their planetary correspondence. But the holistic practice is really what gives the death more power, because it's putting it in proper context and in proper portions for the human being. And remember, we are human beings. We are alive. And so if you introduce an energy that is contrary to life, then you will be taking something away. But there's a healthy balance. If you overdo it, you're going past a point of diminishing returns. And you'll probably be manifesting some diminishing returns.